The story of the Indian Constitution begins long before its first words were written. It starts with the arrival of the British in India. The British East India Company came to India in the year 1600. They came as traders, seeking spices, cotton, and other valuable goods. For a long time, their focus was purely on commerce and establishing trading posts in places like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. They were one of several European companies competing for a share of India's immense wealth. However, the political landscape of India was changing. The mighty Mughal Empire was weakening, creating a power vacuum that ambitious local rulers and foreign companies were eager to fill. The companies saw an opportunity not just to trade, but to rule. The shift from a trading entity to a territorial power was gradual but decisive. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was a major turning point. Here, the East India Company, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal. This victory gave the company immense political influence and control over the rich revenues of Bengal. Following this, the Battle of Buxar in 1764 further solidified their power. The company was granted the Diwani rights, which meant they could collect taxes and administer civil justice in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was a significant step. The company was no longer just a group of merchants. It was now a governing body, a ruler in its own right, laying the groundwork for what would become the British Raj. With these new administrative functions, the British government in London started to take notice. The company's affairs in India were becoming chaotic, and its officials were accumulating vast personal fortunes, often through corrupt means. To regulate the company's activities and assert its own authority, the British Parliament began passing a series of acts. The first of these was the Regulating Act of 1773. This act was a landmark piece of legislation because it was the first time the British government directly intervened in the company's management in India. It marked the beginning of centralized administration and parliamentary control over Indian affairs, a process that would continue to evolve over the next century and a half. This period, known as Company Rule, lasted from 1773 until 1858. During this time, the British expanded their dominion across the Indian subcontinent through wars, treaties, and strategic annexations. They introduced new systems of administration, justice, and revenue collection that profoundly altered the existing Indian social and economic structures. While they built infrastructure like railways and telegraph lines, their primary goal was the exploitation of India's resources for the benefit of Britain. This long period of foreign domination, economic drain, and administrative change set the stage for a powerful reaction: the rise of Indian nationalism and the long, arduous struggle for freedom. The consolidation of British power did not go unchallenged. Throughout the 19th century, a growing sense of national consciousness began to emerge among the Indian people. This was fueled by several factors. The introduction of Western education, while intended to create a class of Indian administrators loyal to the crown, also exposed educated Indians to ideas of liberty, equality, and democracy. They read about the American and French revolutions and began to question the legitimacy of foreign rule in their own land. The shared experience of being governed by a foreign power created a common identity among people from different regions, religions, and linguistic backgrounds. They started to see themselves not just as Bengalis, Marathis, or Tamils, but as Indians. The Great Revolt of 1857 was a major watershed event in this journey. Though it was suppressed by the British with great force, it shook the foundations of their rule in India. It demonstrated the depth of Indian resentment against foreign domination and became a symbol of a united struggle for independence. In the aftermath of the revolt, the British government took direct control from the East India Company, but the spirit of resistance had been ignited. In the following decades, numerous political associations and organizations were formed across the country. These early groups aimed to petition the government for greater Indian participation in administration and for the redressal of specific grievances, laying the groundwork for a more organized political movement. The founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885 marked a crucial milestone in the organized struggle for freedom. Initially, its demands were moderate. the early leaders of the Congress, often called the moderates, believed in constitutional agitation. They submitted petitions and resolutions to the British government, asking for reforms such as the expansion of legislative councils and more opportunities for Indians in the civil services. They had faith in the British sense of justice and fair play and hoped to achieve their goals through gradual, peaceful means. Their work was vital in creating a national platform for political discourse and in politically educating the Indian populace about their rights and the issues facing the nation. However, as the 20th century began, a more assertive and radical form of nationalism started to gain ground. Leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, and Bipin Chandra Pal, known as the extremists, grew impatient with the slow pace of reforms. They advocated for more direct action and famously declared, "Swaraj or self-rule is my birthright and I shall have it." The demand was no longer just for more participation in a British-run government, it was a call for complete self-governance. This growing clamour for self-rule put immense pressure on the British authorities, forcing them to introduce a series of constitutional reforms, even as they tried to suppress the rising tide of the freedom movement. The Revolt of 1857 was a seismic event that forced the British to completely rethink their approach to governing India. The uprising revealed the deep flaws in the East India Company's administration and the widespread discontent it had generated. In response, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, 1858. This act is significant because it officially ended the rule of the East India Company and transferred all its powers, territories, and revenues directly to the British Crown. India was now to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty the Queen. This marked the formal beginning of the British Raj, where India was directly administered by the British government. The Act introduced several major changes in the administrative structure. It abolished the Board of Control and the Court of Directors, the two bodies that had previously managed the company's affairs. In their place, it created a new office, the Secretary of State for India. This official was a member of the British Cabinet and was responsible to the British Parliament for all matters related to the governance of India. To assist the Secretary of State, a 15-member Council of India was established. This move centralised authority over India firmly within the British governmental structure in London, ensuring that all major policy decisions were made far from Indian shores. In India, the Act changed the designation of the highest authority. The Governor-General of India was now also given the title of Viceroy. The Viceroy was the direct representative of the British Crown in India. Lord Canning, who was the Governor-General during the Revolt of 1857, thus became the first Viceroy of India. The Viceroy was granted extensive powers to administer the country on behalf of the Crown, assisted by an Executive Council. The fundamental principle of this new system was to establish a more responsible and accountable administration, at least in theory, though the accountability was to the British Parliament, not to the Indian people. While the Act of 1858 was primarily aimed at improving the machinery of governance and consolidating British control, it did not fundamentally alter the system of government that had developed under the company. It was a formalization of power, a change in masters from a commercial company to the Crown itself. The promise of better governance was made, but the core objective remained the same: to secure British interests and maintain its imperial hold over the vast Indian subcontinent. This act set the stage for the next phase of British rule, a period that would see both further administrative reforms and an intensification of the Indian struggle for self-determination. As the Indian nationalist movement grew more vocal, the British government recognized the need to make some concessions to associate Indians with the process of lawmaking. This led to the enactment of a series of laws known as the Indian Councils Acts of 1861, 1892, and 1909. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 is a notable landmark because it made a beginning of representative institutions. It provided for the Viceroy to nominate some Indians as non-official members to his expanded Legislative Council. In 1862, Lord Canning nominated 3 Indians to this council: the Raja of Benares, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. This was a very small step, but it was the first time Indians were formally included in the legislative process. The Act of 1861 also initiated the process of decentralization by restoring the legislative powers to the provinces of Bombay and Madras. This reversed the centralizing trend that had started with the Regulating Act of 1773. It laid the foundation for the development of provincial legislatures, which would later become important arenas of political activity for Indian leaders. However, the powers of these legislative councils were extremely limited. The non-official members were nominated, not elected, and they had no real power. They could not discuss the budget or ask questions about the actions of the executive. The councils were essentially advisory bodies, designed to give the government a semblance of consulting Indian opinion without giving away any real authority. The Indian Councils Act of 1892 was the next step in this evolutionary process. It increased the number of non-official members in both the central and provincial legislative councils. More importantly, it introduced a limited and indirect principle of election for filling up some of these non-official seats. The word election was not explicitly used in the Act, but it allowed for a process where certain bodies, like universities and district boards, could recommend persons for nomination by the Viceroy or governors. The Act also expanded the functions of the councils, giving them the power to discuss the annual budget and to ask questions to the executive, although they could not vote on the budget or ask supplementary questions. The most significant of this series was the Indian Councils Act of 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. This act considerably increased the size of the legislative councils, both at the central and provincial levels. For the first time, it allowed for the association of Indians with the executive councils of the Viceroy and governors. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. The Act also introduced a system of direct elections for some seats, though the franchise was very limited. Critically, however, it introduced the concept of a separate electorate for Muslims. This meant that Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters, a move that sowed the seeds of communal politics and separatism. The Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, really didn't satisfy the aspirations of Indian nationalists, who were demanding a much more substantial form of self-government. The period that followed was marked by some pretty significant events, including the First World War, where India made a massive contribution to the British war effort. In recognition of this, and to, appease the growing nationalist sentiment, the British government made a historic declaration in 1917. They stated that their policy was the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in India. To give effect to this policy, the Government of India Act of 1919 was passed, which is famously known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. The Act of 1919 introduced several important features. For the first time, it actually demarcated the central and provincial subjects, separating their areas of administration. This created a clearer division of powers, which interestingly would later be adopted in the Constitution of India. The Act also introduced a system called Diarchy, or Rule of Two, in the provinces. Under this rather complex arrangement, the provincial subjects were divided into 2 parts, transferred and reserved. The transferred subjects, such as education and health, were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the Legislative Council. The reserved subjects, like finance and police, remained under the direct control of the governor and his Executive Council, who were not responsible to the legislature. At the central level, the Act of 1919 introduced bicameralism, creating a 2-house legislature for the very first time. The Indian Legislative Council was replaced by an upper house, called the Council of State, and a lower house, known as the Legislative Assembly. The majority of members in both houses were now to be chosen by direct election. However, the franchise was severely restricted based on property, tax, or education qualifications, so only a small fraction of the Indian population could actually vote. While the act marked a significant step forward, the system of diarchy proved to be unworkable and unsatisfactory and, honestly, the ultimate power remained firmly in British hands. The limitations of the 1919 Act and the continued demand for full self-government led to the next major constitutional development, the Government of India Act of 1935. This was a long and detailed document that served as the blueprint for many provisions of the present Indian constitution. It proposed the establishment of an all-India federation, consisting of the British Indian provinces and the princely states. It abolished diarchy in the provinces and introduced what was called provincial autonomy in its place. This meant that the entire provincial administration was placed under ministers who were responsible to the provincial legislatures. This system came into effect in 1937 and was a major victory for the nationalist movement. The demand for a constituent assembly, a body elected by the people to frame a constitution for a free India, was a central plank of the nationalist movement from the 1930s onwards. The idea was first put forward by M.N. Roy, a pioneer of the communist movement in India, in 1934. The Indian National Congress officially adopted this demand in 1935. The British government for a long time resisted this idea. However, the pressures of the Second World War and the intensification of the freedom struggle under Mahatma Gandhi's leadership made it impossible for them to ignore this demand any longer. The August Offer of 1940 and the Cripps Mission of 1942 both acknowledged the principle of a constituent assembly, but their proposals were rejected by the Indian leaders. Finally, in 1946, the British government sent the Cabinet Mission to India to discuss the transfer of power and the formation of a constitution-making body. The mission's plan provided for the establishment of a constituent assembly. The members of this assembly were not to be elected directly by the people based on universal adult franchise, as the nationalists had wanted. Instead, they were to be elected indirectly by the members of the provincial legislative assemblies, which had themselves been elected on a limited franchise. The seats were allocated to each province based on its population and were divided among the three principal communities, Muslims, Sikhs, and General, meaning all others, in proportion to their population. The elections to the Constituent Assembly were held in July and August of 1946. The Indian National Congress won a massive majority, securing 208 of the 296 seats allocated to British India. The Muslim League won 73 seats, which included most of the seats reserved for Muslims. The princely states, which were given 93 seats, initially decided to stay away from the assembly. Following the elections, the assembly held its first meeting on December 9, 1946. The Muslim League boycotted this meeting, insisting on its demand for a separate state of Pakistan. Therefore, the first session was attended by only 211 members, with Dr. Satchidananda Sinha, the oldest member, presiding as the temporary president. Despite the absence of the Muslim League and the looming shadow of partition, the Constituent Assembly began its historic task. On December 11, 1946, Dr. Rajendra Prasad was elected as the permanent president of the Assembly. A few days later, on December 13, Jawaharlal Nehru moved the historic Objectives Resolution. This resolution laid down the fundamental principles and philosophy that would guide the framing of the Constitution. It declared India as an independent sovereign republic and promised to secure for all its citizens justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. This resolution was unanimously adopted by the Assembly and later became the preamble of the Indian Constitution. The framing of the Indian Constitution was a monumental and complex task. The Constituent Assembly, representing the diverse people of India, had to create a document that would not only establish a democratic political structure, but also address the deep-seated social and economic inequalities prevalent in the country. To handle this enormous work systematically, the Assembly appointed a number of committees to deal with different aspects of the Constitution. There were major committees like the Union Powers Committee, the Provincial Constitution Committee, and the Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights, Minorities and Tribal Areas. The reports of these committees provided the basic material for the Constitution. Of all the committees of the Constituent Assembly, the most important was the Drafting Committee. It was set up on August 29, 1947, shortly after India's independence. Its task was to prepare a draft of the new constitution based on the reports from the various other committees. This committee was chaired by the brilliant legal scholar and visionary leader, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. He is rightly regarded as the father of the Constitution of India for his immense contribution and his masterful steering of the drafting process. The drafting committee consisted of 7 members who were all distinguished jurists and experts, and they worked tirelessly to create a cohesive and comprehensive legal framework for the new nation. The drafting committee took less than 6 months to prepare its first draft, which was published in February 1948. This draft was then made public and circulated widely. The people of India were given 8 months to discuss the draft and propose amendments. This was a remarkable exercise in public participation. The drafting committee received and considered a vast number of comments, criticisms, and suggestions from the public, press, and provincial assemblies. Based on this feedback, the committee prepared a second draft, which was published in October 1948. The process was thorough, transparent, and democratic, ensuring that the final document reflected the will of the people. The final stage of the constitution-making process was the detailed discussion of the draft in the Constituent Assembly. Dr. Ambedkar introduced the final draft on November 4, 1948, and the Assembly began a clause-by-clause consideration. This process, known as the second reading, was incredibly detailed and lasted for nearly a year. The members of the Assembly discussed every single provision, and a total of 7,653 amendments were proposed, of which 2,473 were actually discussed in the Assembly. This meticulous debate and scrutiny ensured that the Constitution was robust, well-considered, and capable of standing the test of time. The entire process showcased the democratic spirit and intellectual rigor of India's founding fathers. After over a year of intense debate and discussion, the Constituent Assembly completed its work on the Constitution. The third and final reading of the draft Constitution began on November 14, 1949. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar moved a motion that the Constitution, as settled by the Assembly, be passed. The motion was debated for several days, during which members delivered powerful speeches, reflecting on the historic journey and the significance of the document they had created. Finally, on November 26, 1949, the motion was declared as passed. The Constitution of India was officially adopted by the Constituent Assembly on this day. The members signed the document, marking the successful culmination of their historic endeavor. The Constitution, as adopted on November 26, 1949, contained a preamble, 395 articles, and 8 schedules. This day is celebrated in India as Constitution Day or National Law Day to commemorate the adoption of the Constitution. It is important to note that while the Constitution was adopted on this date, it did not come into full effect immediately. Some provisions of the Constitution relating to citizenship, elections, provisional parliament, and other temporary provisions came into force on November 26, 1949 itself. These were necessary to manage the transition from the old system to the new one smoothly. The Constituent Assembly had successfully fulfilled its promise of giving India its own governing document. The major part of the Constitution, however, commenced on a different date. The Founding Fathers chose January 26, 1950, as the date for the formal commencement of the Constitution. This date was chosen for its historical significance. It was on this day in 1930 that the Indian National Congress had celebrated Purna Swaraj, or Complete Independence Day, following the resolution passed at its Lahore session in December 1929. By choosing this date, the framers linked the birth of the Republic to a pivotal moment in the freedom struggle. On January 26, 1950, India ceased to be a dominion of the British Crown and became a sovereign, secular, socialist, and democratic republic. This day is celebrated every year as Republic Day. On that historic day, the Government of India Act of 1935 and the Indian Independence Act of 1947 were repealed. the Constituent Assembly itself ceased to exist, transforming into the Provisional Parliament of India until the first general elections were held in 1951 and 52. Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who had presided over the Constituent Assembly, became the first president of the Republic of India. The journey that began with the struggles against colonial rule had finally culminated in the establishment of a sovereign nation governed by its own people, through a constitution that they had given to themselves. The birth of the Indian Republic was a moment of immense pride and hope for the future. Understanding the historical background of the Indian Constitution is not merely an academic exercise. It is essential for comprehending the very soul of Indian polity. The Constitution was not drafted in a vacuum. It is a living document that emerged from a long and arduous historical struggle. The values of liberty, equality, and fraternity enshrined in the preamble are a direct response to the centuries of colonial oppression and social hierarchy. The commitment to democracy and a republic was a firm rejection of monarchical and imperial rule. Every article and every provision carries the weight of this history, reflecting the aspirations and ideals of the freedom movement. Studying this journey helps us appreciate the rationale behind the specific features of the Indian Constitution. For instance, the adoption of a parliamentary form of government was influenced by the familiarity with the British system, while the inclusion of a chapter on fundamental rights was inspired by the American Constitution and driven by the need to guarantee basic human freedoms that were denied under colonial rule. The federal structure with a strong centre was a considered response to the immense diversity of India and the need to maintain national unity and integrity, a lesson learned from the painful partition of the country in 1947. Furthermore, this historical perspective provides crucial context for interpreting the Constitution today. When we face contemporary challenges related to federalism, minority rights, or social justice, understanding the original intent of the framers becomes invaluable. The debates in the Constituent Assembly offer a rich source of insight into why certain choices were made. They show us that the framers grappled with the same complex issues that we face today, and their wisdom can guide our path. This historical awareness fosters a deeper respect for the Constitution and the democratic institutions it has established, reminding us of the sacrifices made to secure them. In conclusion, the making of the Indian Constitution is a story of national transformation. It is the story of a nation finding its voice and defining its own destiny. From the early days of British commercial expansion to the rise of nationalism, from the gradual introduction of legislative reforms to the monumental task of the Constituent Assembly, each step was a building block for the modern Indian state. By studying this history, as detailed in works on Indian polity, citizens can gain a profound understanding of their rights, their duties, and the foundational principles of their nation. It is a legacy that empowers every Indian to participate more meaningfully in the democratic process and to uphold the values for which the Founding Fathers fought so valiantly.